Halloween is just around the corner. It's generally a time of good-natured fun and mischief when people decorate their yards with fake spider webs, jack-o'-lanterns, and inflatable monsters. Kids, and those young at heart, dress up like zombies, ghosts, vampires, and all kinds of monstrous things. But where did our culture get these monsters? How far back does our fear of the undead go? Let's dig in. On the southern coast of Cyprus, situated on a steep escarpment, is the prehistoric site known as Choirokoitia Vouni. This was a relatively large village dated to the late Aceramic Neolithic, that is roughly the 7th millennium BC. This is an exceptional site, and not only because it's so old. Choirokoitia is not fully excavated, but what has been excavated shows it extended some 180 meters up the slope of a hill, and the site is believed to extend further north of the excavated area. The site is composed of several clusters of buildings. These buildings are typically round and are usually clustered around a small central courtyard. Why this is the case is not clear. It's been suggested this may reflect a polygamous community, but again, it's not clear why the village has the layout that it does. Neolithic sites on Cyprus typically were cleared before they were abandoned, so there are very few artifacts available to help us reconstruct patterns of life. However, grinding installations and hearths in most buildings suggest an agricultural community lived there. These building clusters were built at the same time as a large enclosure wall was built that presumably enclosed the entire community. And while there are interesting questions to ask of this evidence, what is even more curious is the prevalence of a large amount of intramural burials. In every building excavated, burials have been found. Simple pits were dug, the deceased were interred, dirt was piled back on top, and then plaster was laid over, creating the floor of the building. Depending on how you count it, there are at least 175 individuals, but other tallies are as high as 240. These include both male and female individuals, and from neonates up through adulthood. There are very few consistent patterns in these burials. Most, but not all, are placed on their side. Some, but not all, have small amounts of grave gifts. Most, but not all, are simple cist graves with no embellishments. And some structures in the village apparently had only burials, with no evidence of domestic life in the house. The point being, there are enough burials that we can identify a range of normative burial patterns, even if some of them seem odd to modern sensibilities. But we also see several burials at Choirokoitia that are best described as deviant. Before going any further, a brief word of warning if this is a subject you're interested in researching. Deviant burials is a good search term, but just be careful typing that into Google. Trust me.
Deviant burials are a classification of mortuary practice archaeologists use under the wider category of the archaeology of fear or archaeology of anxiety. This is usually because deviant burial practices are indicative of necrophobia. That is, for some reason or another, the interring society has a fear of death or the dead, usually specific instances of the dead. This may be because the dead was different in life, perhaps they had a birth defect or deformity, or they were a criminal, or behaved in some antisocial way like engaging in illicit cult behavior. So when archaeologists see deviant burial practices in the archaeological record, this usually denotes some form of necrophobia and thus is generally categorized under the umbrella of an archaeology of fear.
From the literature on the archaeology of fear, scholars note there is an important emphasis that the boundaries of this fear are set by what are called emotional communities. That is to say, there are social communities that define, share, tolerate, and deplore particular emotional expressions. So the archaeology of fear is in large part identifying material correlates of these socially bounded and accepted fears or anxieties. Some cultures have specific fears that are not universally shared. The evil eye is a great example. This is a folk custom or belief shared in many cultures, especially around the Mediterranean, that certain people can cast an evil eye and damage something valued or precious. This shared anxiety has resulted in all kinds of behaviors meant to mitigate this threat, including phrases, gestures, and amulets. While this folk belief is fairly widespread, it is still culturally defined. hanging evil eye amulets is not common practice here in the States. However, some fears approach universality, specifically the fear of monsters, especially humanoid monsters. And this is what we see at Choirokoitia. Of the couple hundred burials at the site, about a dozen can be described as deviant. As a category, such deviant burials can be identified in a couple ways.
A burial may be described as deviant if the deceased is interred in an unusual way. If the cultural custom is to place the deceased prone on the back, then if discovered in the fetal position, the deceased would be interred out of the ordinary, for example. If there is a mass burial with no signs of disease or war, that would also be classified as deviant. Variations in standard burial methodology are also generally seen to be deviant. Other examples of deviant burials include an inhumation where cremation is dominant or vice versa, or if the interred shows signs of perimortem torture, crime, or special ritual. Certain infant burials may be included in this category, or those who show evidence of being bound, decapitated, buried unusually deep or with weights, or even cemeteries with only the young or the old. But again, it's important to stress cultural custom will dictate what is deviant. Zoroastrian sky burials would be deviant except for the cultural custom and religious belief informing that practice, for example.
Now, at Choirokoitia, there are two specific forms of deviance we see based on the entire sample of burials. In Tholos 17, two burials were found. Burial 3 is of an adult male placed on his side. He wore a shell and stone bead necklace. When he was buried, he also had a large quern or grinding stone placed on his chest. In the same structure is Burial 2, a young boy, estimated to be 8 or 9, who's found laying on his stomach with arms and legs apparently having been bound behind him. He was placed partially inside a broken stone bowl. The excavators believe these two burials were contemporaneous, and Burial 2 is thought to either represent a foundation ritual or a human sacrifice, likely done on the occasion of the burial of the adult. Nearly half of the burials with grave goods had large stones placed on either the head or chest of the interred. This is a fairly large incidence rate, but most of the excavators still take it to represent a deviant practice. The other burial, with the stone placed on its chest, is also a deviant burial practice, but is something we see with a much higher incidence rate at the site. Nearly 50 burials have large stones placed on either the head or chest of the interred. Now, this is admittedly a large number of the total burials at the site, but most of the excavators still take it to represent a deviant practice. Taken together, scholars postulate these burials may represent necrophobia, specifically a fear of revenants, that is, zombies. Today we laugh about zombies clawing their way out of the ground, but for the people of Choirokoitia, it wasn't a joke. It was a real enough fear that they altered how they buried their dead for centuries, all just to keep that possibility in check. The fear of the dead reanimating is the leading suggestion as to why several of these bodies are placed under stone weights. In the absence of textual sources to articulate the thought process, scholars believe that with the introduction of grave goods in burials, we may postulate that there was a shared belief that part of the person continued after their body died, and that whatever part that survives could make use of what was given to them in the grave. But the logic also goes that if a part of a person survives and could move on to some kind of afterlife, it stands to reason that they may not move on, and they may try to come back. In case of such an eventuality, a corpse that is buried not only under meters of dirt, but also under a heavy stone would be prevented from doing so, or at least not be able to physically rise from the grave as an embodied vengeful revenant.
Ghosts are a different matter. The belief in ghosts is posited to go back to the Upper Paleolithic based on the presence of grave goods. But we need not rely on archaeology alone to confirm a fear of ghosts. There are ample textual sources which tell ancient ghost stories. Even Pliny the Younger relates a ghost story in one of his writings. Now, we aren't going to read the entire story here. You can find it in his letter to Sura. We also aren't going to go over the whole letter, but rather want to focus in on just this one story within it. For some context, the letter is asking about whether the addressee believes in ghosts, specters, and apparitions, whether they are real or just flights of fancy. Pliny relates that he is inclined to believe in them and then gives examples of stories he's been told. One particular story he recounts is about a haunted house in Athens. He explains how in Athens there was a large and spacious but ill-reputed and pestilential house. It gained this reputation because at night the sound of clashing iron and rattling fetters could be heard moving through the house. This would be followed by an apparition of an old bearded man rattling his chains. The inhabitants would be so frightened, even in the daytime, that they would be driven to madness from their inability to find any rest. This meant the house was impossible to keep occupied, and the owners had essentially abandoned it to the ghost. That is, until Athenodorus, a philosopher, came to town. He saw the house was on sale for cheap and inquired why this was the case. Upon learning the reason, his curiosity piqued and he moved into the house. He stayed up late writing and at first didn't hear anything. Eventually he heard in the distance the sound of iron in the house, but he stayed focused on his writing, and then the sound grew closer and louder, until it was in the very room he was in. He finally looked up to see the apparition as others had, but now it beckoned him to follow. At first he didn't, but the apparition was insistent. He stood up from his writing and followed the ghost through the house until it vanished in the courtyard. The next day, Athenodorus had the magistrates dig up the courtyard of the house. There they found a decaying corpse bound in irons. The city had the man buried and the haunting was resolved. In this story, the spirit of the man could not rest and move on to the next phase of existence because he lacked a proper burial. He didn't reanimate his corpse in this instance, but his spirit remained to haunt the living. It may surprise you that a thinker as serious as Pliny was engaged in a question about the reality of ghosts, but this was not an uncommon belief in the ancient world. Whether they existed or not was not a subject for campfires late at night, but a real question that even impacted real estate prices. And this is far from the only ghost story in the ancient world. We even have depictions of ghosts from a variety of cultures. But in this story, the ghost is fairly innocuous. He simply wanted to be laid to rest properly. However, not all spirits that wandered among the living were so benign, and for the more vengeful or dangerous spirits, people sought protection.
While there are many kinds of amulets from the ancient world, I want to focus on this one. This is one of a pair of amulets purported to be from the site of Arslan Tash and dated to the 7th century BC. These amulets were purchased on the antiquities market, and naturally their authenticity has been questioned. Nowadays, most scholars largely accept their authenticity, but they do note that there's still some doubt about it. It's kind of like what we just did. Both amulets contain text and images that are meant to be apotropaic, meaning they're meant to ward off evil. In this case, one of them may be an attempt to ward off a vampire. Interpreting the text and images on these kinds of amulets is notoriously difficult. There are examples where the text on amulets is apparently gibberish, but the letters are meant to be magical. So there can be signs that look like cuneiform or look like hieroglyphics or even Aramaic, but don't actually correlate to any script. It's not necessarily that the makers were illiterate and just mimicking text, but there were some magical properties or otherwise esoteric meaning to the symbols. Because textual incantations are often poetic and can be quite sophisticated, they aren't usually something we would attribute to illiterate artisans. And given the poetic and incantational nature of the inscriptions, it can be hard to get accurate translations. When these inscriptions are paired with images, often of creatures and beings that aren't discussed in polite society lest you draw their attention, interpretations can become quite speculative. These two amulets are stylistically more Mesopotamian but have Aramaic inscriptions, again contributing to the skepticism about their authenticity. The first amulet is the more famous and more widely discussed, but I want to talk about this one. This tablet has Aramaic inscriptions on both sides, as well as a crude depiction of a monstrous figure. The inscription has been translated in a variety of ways. The specifics of the translation can be quite different, but in general it seems there is an incantation directed against two specific spirits who are in some way associated with the eye, either that they target someone's vision or that they are fascinators who cast the evil eye. The drawing is often taken to depict one of these beings. The first line has a particularly interesting phrase. How this phrase is translated depends on what root is being conjugated here. It may be the root for to splatter, in which case this would mean "O blood splatterer," where this is an epithet or euphemism for a spiritual being. Alternatively, if it comes from the root for "to suck," it would mean "O bloodsucker," which is, in modern parlance, a vampire. And seeing this as a vampire isn't totally uncalled for, as there are other references to vampires in the ancient world. In other Semitic languages, there is a term for leech, which can be used to refer to a kind of demon or spirit, a spirit which is like a leech sucking the life force away, which again would suggest a vampire. There are several other spirits and demons in Mesopotamian folklore that had vampiric qualities, even if they aren't referred to directly as blood-sucking. We even get stories of vampires from the Greco-Roman world.
In the life of Apollonius by the Greek author Philostratus, we are recounted a story where we see a blurring of boundaries between what we may call a zombie, a ghost, and a vampire into one figure, the so-called Bride of Corinth. Apollonius was a known philosopher and purported miracle worker of his day, that is the 1st century AD, though he is not well known now outside of the work of Philostratus. But among the many wonders attributed to Apollonius is his saving of a young man Menipus from a nefarious female figure variously called an apparition, lamia, and an impusa. Each of these terms have particular use histories in Greco-Roman mythic literature, but Philostratus seems to use them in somewhat unique ways here. As the story unfolds, this young man, Menipus, was a disciple of a philosopher, but became enamored with a foreign woman. She was good-looking and extremely dainty, and said that she was rich, although she was really, as it turned out, not one of these things, but was only so in semblance. He was enticed by the woman who said she was Phoenician and lived near Corinth. She told him, "When you reach the place this evening, you will hear my voice as I sing to you, and you shall have such wine as you never before drank, and there will be no rival to disturb you, and we two beautiful beings will live together." Philostratus reminds us that while he was in general a strenuous philosopher, he was nevertheless susceptible to the tender passion, and he constantly sought out this woman, not realizing she was an apparition. Then Apollonius encountered Menipus and told him, "You are a fine youth and are hunted by fine women, but in this case you are cherishing a serpent, and a serpent cherishes you." It's noteworthy that lamia in Greek myth were often thought of as half serpent, half woman. Young Menipus is shocked at the accusation, but at Apollonius' prodding, he agrees that if she were as she presents herself, he ought to marry this woman without delay. At the wedding, Apollonius pressed Menipus and told him all the fine gold and silver decor is fake. It exists, but does not exist. He tells Menipus, "And that you may realize the truth of what I say, this fine bride is one of the vampires, or impusa, that is to say, of those beings whom the many regard as lamias and hobgoblins. Such beings fall in love, and they are devoted to the delights of Aphrodite, but especially to the flesh of human beings, and they decoy with such delights those whom they mean to devour in their feasts." The creature's ploy was exposed, and Apollonius showed the goblets as light as air, and the guests vanished out of sight. Apollonius pressed the woman, who admitted to her would-be victim that she was fattening him up with pleasures before devouring his body, for it was her habit to feed upon young and beautiful bodies because their blood is pure and strong. Here the woman is some kind of ghost or apparition that seeks more than eternal rest, but is dangerous, one who is seeking to drain the life and vitality from the living like a vampire. So when we toss up a plastic skeleton in the yard or laugh at a friend's fake vampire fangs, we're playing with ideas that our ancestors took very seriously. For them, monsters weren't seasonal fun, they were genuine threats that required ritual, architecture, and amulets to keep at bay. Heavy stones over the chests of a corpse, incantations carved into amulets, or stories warning of ghostly visitations weren't just entertainment, they were acts of survival in a world where the boundary between life and death was fragile and sometimes frighteningly porous. We play with monsters, they lived with them. To them, an encounter with a zombie or a vampire wasn't limited to a trick or treat.